Hello folks, and welcome to the last Photopea skills and techniques tutorial. Today we're going to be working on the following. So let's get started with some basic image retouching. Now this is something that you're going to use if you take photos and you bring them into your computer and you realize that they may not be exposed properly, it might be a little too dark, might be a little light. There's only so much you can do in Photoshop to sort of fix a bad photo. Obviously, your best option is to have your camera settings such that you take good photos and then you've got less work to do after. But there are a couple things you can do to kind of tweak things. So I will show you an example of that. If we go to our test images folder, and there should be an image that's called Underexposed, very common problem in photography, where it's a little bit dark, too much sort of shadowy areas and tones and things that can probably be cleaned up a little bit. Again, you can only do so much, but we'll do our best to make a better edited version here. When you're dealing with photos that are either overexposed or underexposed, the best thing you can do is start with what's known as the levels. Just turn the background off here. So if we go into our image and then we go to adjustments, we've seen this menu before. There's lots of things you can do in here. You've got brightness and contrast, levels, curves, and exposure. If you think that a photo is underexposed, your best option may be go right to exposure, and you could play with this to bring up highlights in the image. You just sort of play with the sliders and get it to the point that you like. You got to be careful because you don't want to wash photos out, and if they are overexposed, that they should you'll end up washing out your pictures. So you don't want that. So you got to be a little careful about how you play with these things. And another problem is if you've got really dark areas, bring out the background, you're going to notice that it gets grainy as you do it, which is kind of cool if you're trying to create that effect, but it's not cool if you're trying to fix it. So you just got to go in here and play with these adjustments. And there's auto tone, contrast, and colors. I think that they don't work all that well, to be honest with you. But you can throw those in as well if you want. In fact, I really don't like that auto tone, so I'm just going to get rid of that, or auto color rather. And the one where you're going to get the most sort of value is the curves. And when you go into the curves, what it shows you is this 45-degree line here. And what most photographers will do in their touch-up is they'll make sort of what's known as an S-curve to try and bring out the highlights a bit, and then also on the low end to play with the shadows. Now this one is pretty underexposed, so you're going to want to a whole lot better on this image. It's pretty badly underexposed, so don't know that we're doing a whole lot of good here. Now it's got these auto features at the bottom, and what these are for is that if there's something in the picture that is supposed to be dead white, you can click this and then click something that is supposed to be as white can be, and then it'll automatically adjust the other colors based on that. So if I think her teeth should be white, actually probably the white part of the eye will be the whitest part on the body. If we click that, you'll notice that it tries to readjust everything, but again, it's just such a bad picture that there's only so much you can do. So I'm actually going to junk that one and probably messed it up a bit. So that's why you keep the original, right? Go back to the original, and let's try that image adjustment again. We'll go into our curves. And you can see just from the data on the picture, usually the data will be more distributed throughout the image, but in this case it's not. So I'm going to have to play down here a bit more, and I'll bring out the highlights a little bit while trying to retain some shadows. So this is probably the best I'm going to be able to do for this photo. Again, it gets grainy, but from a distance it's probably not bad, and it's certainly better than the original. Some of the highlights coming on the back. Again, the problem is that the more you adjust these, the more you change the exposure, bring out the levels, the more grain you're going to get in the picture. So the best option is always to take a good picture. The second best option is to just kind of do what you can with those levels, and you can make multiple levels to try out different techniques in your image. So if I go to another version here, let's just see if I can use the auto feature. But I think that this image might be kind of so badly damaged that it's Oh, that's much better. Okay, so, clicking on the tooth instead of on the white of the eyes, using that as my white point reference seems to have done a much better job. And you can also adjust the highlights, or sorry, the shadows and whatnot by using the black one if you know there's something that's supposed to be very black. Then it'll add a little bit more contrast on the black side. So I've done both the black adjustment and the white adjustment, and it's certainly a better picture. So, what do you prefer? Is that the one? Or is this the one? And is there much of a difference between the two? I would certainly say that the one that was edited last using the curves and sort of the white point reference and the black point reference is definitely the best of the two. So that would be the one that I saved there, and it's certainly better than the original. So little touch-ups there, and a lot of time you just going to have to play with them to see what the best technique will be. All right, last two skills. We're going to do some shadows and some reflections. So we'll go open. And what are we going to do for a shadow? Don't appear to have my shadow picture in here, so I'll make sure that I have that available for you. It's the gear. That's the one I want. So we're going to add a shadow to this gear, and we're going to have the shadow go down to the left, which means I'm going to have to change my placement of this gear in the image, and I'm probably going to have to add a little bit to the left side of the canvas, so I'll do that. First off, let's get rid of the background. So I'll just Control J to grab a new layer, and then I'm going to select the gear, and I'm going to make that its own layer too. So this is a very, very highly contrasted background. Should be very easy just using the Magic Wand tool, and then adding the white areas click by click, or you could have just turned off contiguous and would have done the same thing. So I've got the background white selected. I'm going to Control Shift I to inverse that. So I just have the gear, and then Control J to make a new layer that only has the gear on it. So now, oops, Magic Wand tool. So now I can move the gear around without having any background there to affect it. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to need a bigger canvas. So if I put the gear down here and my shadows over here, I probably need more. So here's how you can add to your canvas without impacting the size of everything else. If you go to Image and you go to Canvas Size, it'll allow you to change the size of the canvas, and it'll allow you to anchor what's currently there to a certain point. So what we're going to do is we're going to anchor this to the lower right corner, and then I'm just going to change these while keeping the link by turning that link off. I want that link off because I just want to change the width. I don't want to change the height. So the relative box says basically how much do you want to add. I could double all these if I want twice as much space, but I notice my width is 720, so I'll maybe just add another 500 onto it. So if I go to relative and I don't adjust the height, but I do add 500 to the width, it should anchor this here and add the width on the left. So let's just see. Okay, so that's exactly what it did. It added the 500 pixels in this area here without adding any more to the height, which is what I want. Okay, how do we create a shadow? A shadow is basically going to be a copy of your image, except we're going to paint it black, and we're going to kind of fade it out and angle it down and use our skew tools to make it a little bit more realistic. Now, ideally, this image would be on a bit of an angle, because if it's flat on and the sun hits it, sometimes the reflection can look a little bit weird, but we're going to work with it in this orientation anyway. You already know how to play with the skew tools, so you could put this at a bit of a perspective and then add the shadow. But we're going to focus on the shadow part now. So if the shadow is really your entire object represented in black, then we should select our image again, okay, just using the Magic Wand tool. So I'm going to click on the background, and then I'm just going to add in all those areas that were formerly white again, and then invert it, so that I just have the gear selected. Okay, and now I can paint in that area. Okay, now I can paint in that area. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new layer behind the gear. So I'll just call this the gear, and I'll call this one the shadow. And I'm just going to hide the gear for a second and make sure that I'm on the shadow layer. And you can see I've still got my selected area filled in here. So I'm just going to fill in everything that's selected with black right now. So that's going to act as our shadow. And if I move it just a little bit, you'll be able to see it. behind the gear when I turn the gear back on. So you see it there. Actually, it's in front of the gear. I want it behind. So there's our shadow. It doesn't look very realistic right now. It's dead black. It's laying right on the, what would maybe be a wall behind it, which is great if you're doing a shadow on the wall, but not so much if you're doing a shadow on the ground. So now we have to do kind of the more difficult Photoshop work, and it's going to involve skewing this shadow until we get it in a reasonable position. Let's say angling up at, maybe 15 degrees or something like that, but we could certainly play with it. So let's begin doing that. I'm going to hold down the Control key because that's how we are going to skew corners, and I'm just going to start dragging things to where I think they probably should be for a shadow. So you're going to want sort of that perspective as if it's lying on the ground. If the light's coming from this way, the shadow is going to get thrown a little further in this corner than this corner, and then this is going to be certainly narrowed back into where the wheel is. And again, it's just one of those things that you sort of got to play with a little bit to get it where you like it, and then you also want to move it back a little bit so it looks like it's starting behind the image and then moving this way. Okay, and if you want it really flat on the ground, you do something like that. Okay, but I'm gonna go with something that's on a bit more of an angle. We'll just pretend the camera's on an angle, shooting from somewhere over. The light coming from somewhere over here and hitting the ground back there. So now we've got sort of a better start to it. Got a shadow down. It looks like it's sort of in a reasonable area. Play with it as much as you want. Depending on the background that you've chosen, that's gonna have a lot to do with how you play with these skew tools and what you think it should look like at the end. Generally, if the light's coming from this corner, your shadow's gonna kind of go out that way. So play with it and get it where you want. And then we need to make it look a little bit more realistic because right now it's just black, and we know that shadows don't really work that way. Shadows tend to fade out the further they get away, which means we're going to want to use a gradient tool to try to fade that out, and then we can touch it up after that just by using a very, very soft eraser brush. Excuse me. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we've got this layer selected, and instead of all black, we're going to start at black and fade out slowly to white. So our gradient tool is right here, which we've used before. And we do want a black to white gradient, so that should work fine. We do want a linear gradient. That will work fine. By the way, a radial gradient is a gradient that starts out the color in the middle and then gradually goes out in a circle. So this time we're going to use a linear gradient because we want it to start black here and then fade to white in a straight line going this way. As long as we've got the gradient tool selected, we just need to color it so that it goes this way. But we also have to make sure that we've got just the shadow area selected. Otherwise, we're going to have something like this going on in our entire image, and we clearly don't want that. I guess we got to go this way instead. Okay, we don't want that. We just want the shadow area to be affected. So let's just grab our magic wand, and this is all black, so it should be very easy to grab, and it was. And now that it's all grabbed, not including the holes in the gear, we can go back to our gradient tool, and then we can play with where we want that shadow to start and where we want that shadow to end. So I want it fading out maybe even a bit more than that. So I'm going to start my gradient tool way out here, pull it to the end. Okay, that's too much. So I'm going to start a little bit closer on this end so that the white's closer to the left end of the shadow. Okay, that's not bad. I'll Control D. Okay, looking a little better, but shadows also tend not to be that sharp. So throwing a quick Gaussian blur on that layer via the filter menu can also help you out a little bit there. So if I throw a bit of a Gaussian blur at it, just to blur the edges a little bit, now we're looking quite a bit more shadowy. And because it's still a shape, you can just go to the shadow layer and you should still be able to click on it and still be able to move things around. If you want your shadow longer, if you want your shadow shorter, depending on where you think the sun is. And you can just continue to skew it and move it around until you think it matches. Again, this one's not going to look perfect because the gear itself is flat to the screen, which means that it's not you know, it's not the most realistic representation. Ideally, the gear would be skewed a little bit this way so that it looks like there's a perspective. The gears kind of would be going back into this corner, the light or sun or whatever would be hitting it from there and throwing a shadow back down. But the main part is being able to replicate the object, paint it in black, and or use the gradient and blur tool to make yourself a shadow there. And then, you know, after that point, after you get it sort of where you want it, you can stretch it and hide it and do all sorts of things to it. And then if you still need to touch it up a little bit, you can just grab the eraser tool and turn it down really to, you know, very minor levels and pick a very soft brush and then just kind of tap around to fade it out a bit. A lot of that is done by feel as long as you have the main technique there. You can do the rest of it by feel and change your shadow angle and shape and skew and whatnot. But that's the basics of making a shadow for an object that you've got on your screen. And then the final thing we're going to look at is doing a reflection. So we'll open, what do I want to reflect here? I think the box might be an assignment, maybe not. We'll grab the box, and if we're going to do a reflection, we'll do it down at the bottom. We'll just sort of pretend that it's sitting on a glass surface or a mirrored surface or something like that. We're going to need to add area to the bottom. I'm going to make a copy of this thing first, and I'll just call that original. And then, original. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to cut out the background, and I'm going to make the reflection just for the box. I think for the gear, I forgot to put in one more thing. So this shadow's okay, but it you know, it doesn't look very good against the transparent background. So I think I intended to throw another layer in there and just fill that layer with white. Might help bring out the shadow a little bit more. Make sure it's under the shadow layer. There we go. That's where I intended to leave this thing. And maybe fade it out a bit more with the eraser brush. Anyway, back to the box. And we're going to use the same technique to cut out the box. Very, very high contrast background. So I can just select the background, Control-Shift-I to inverse, Control-J to add just the box to a new layer. And I can turn off my original for a bit, and we can work on that reflection. Canvas needs to be a bit bigger, just like the last image. So we'll go to Image, Canvas Size. We're going to anchor it to the top this time, because we want to add to the bottom. We'll do a relative, and this time we have to change the height. And I'm just going to look at what it originally was. It originally was 1465. I'm going to add maybe another 1,000 pixels to that. If it's not enough, you can add more. If it's too much, you can trim out. Okay, and then our goal is going to be to have this section sort of out there, this section here, and that section there. So what we want to do in this one is a little bit different. Now, you could do a very, very, if you have an object that's not at an angle like this one, you could basically just do a copy of the image, pull it down, and then you're done. But when it's got a perspective, so this one's got, you know, sort of at a 30-degree angle, we're going to have to copy each section of the box and work with our reflection sort of one panel at a time. So in doing that, we need to select one panel at a time. So let's take our image, and this is Polygonal Lasso tool, because it's, you know, it's a rectilinear object. The lines are all quite straight. So if I start in this corner here, work my way straight down. Remember, if you hold the Shift key, it'll go straight down while you're doing this, so that'll be easier for you to find the corner. And go straight down, pan over a bit, try to match this guy up perfectly. And then I'm going to go straight up again. Holding the Shift key. And then I'm going to go back to the original starting point. So I've got just that front panel selected. I'm going to Control-J that to a new layer. And maybe I'm just going to call that front right, FR. And then I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go back to the box layer. Make sure you go back to the box layer, because if you try to select this panel on the FR layer, it's not there, right? This layer is just the front right side. So let's go back to the box layer, and we're going to do exactly the same. Okay, so that is this left side. So we'll Control-J that to a new layer. And that one's going to be the front left side, FL. All right, so let's look at the front right side. I'm going to lock the box because I don't want to do anything else to the box. It's going to stay the same. Could lock the original layer too if I wanted to. And we're going to work with the front right first. So we know that a reflection is going to offer a reversed image of this down here somewhere. So we have to keep a couple things in mind. It's going to be reversed, so the letters all have to be reversed, and so everything here needs to be like you would see it in a mirror. But also we know it needs to start there and start here, and then sort of come down. So it is going to be a bit skewed in the representation of the reflected version. So let's just go to our move tool, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to manually drag, whoops, I need to do that. We're going to manually drag this down here, and as we get it past the bottom point, it's going to naturally reflect itself, but you can't just click and drag because it's going to resize the entire object. You have to hold down the shift key as you're doing this to make sure that you bring it down. Now, the reflection does not necessarily need to be the exact same size as the original because it depends on where the angle of light is. The reflection might look like this. It might look, really stretched. You just got to kind of get it where you think it should be, again, depending on where the light's coming from. So there we go. You can see that everything's reflected, so that looks really good. But you also notice there's a disconnect between these two corners, and that's where we're going to use the Skew tool again. So we're going to hold Control, and we're going to bring this up so that it matches that corner perfectly. Okay. And as such, okay, I think I went too high there. No biggie. We just adjust as we go. Okay. And every time I adjust something, every time I adjust the bottom, you're going to have to readjust the top. So let's just play with it. A lot of this stuff is just, kind of playing with it till you get it right. Okay, and where do we think this should be? It's not going to be there, so it's going to tend to be a little bit. Okay, we'll start with that, and we'll see where that leads us. Okay, go in and make sure that it's pretty tight in this corner. You're going to want to make sure that corner matches up pretty closely. Okay, so that's our starting point. This is too high. You can see it's way into the box, so make sure that is just perfect on the edge there. Quick little readjustment. There, we can go in and change that later if we need to readjust this to line it up. All right, let's just lock that layer for now so I don't accidentally change it. And then we're going to go to the front left, and we're going to do the same. Grab from the top, middle, hold Shift, drag it down. Now make sure you match that corner up at the bottom. Transform controls if you feel like those boxes are getting in the way. Okay, so we've got pretty close here. We just need to do a couple of little adjustments. I'm just using, by the way, using the arrow keys to just do your nudge adjustments, just to bring it up or down a little bit. Those tend to be the tools that I use. Okay, I notice I've got a little bit of white there at the top. Okay, so if I threw these behind the original box layer, ooh, accidentally made a copy of that one. I didn't even know I did that. Just accidentally hit Control-J. So if I bring these layers behind the box layer, I might be able to hide that line a little bit, but that line's not a big deal. Okay, it looks like it's on the original, so not much I can do about that. So I'm just using the arrow keys to nudge these up and down a little bit, and then I notice I've got a little bit of an overhang there, but that's not going to matter because we're actually going to fade that out. But I do want those two lines to match up perfectly, so you can do that with a resize or just by bumping it up a little bit. I'll bump it up a little bit. All right, so now we've got a perfectly reversed image on the bottom. We've retained the perspective of the sides. And now that I look at it, this front left I mean, if the light was shining in that direction, that would probably be fine. Or sorry, front right. But going to move up a couple times, back up a little bit. Always take a look. And when it's back, okay, maybe a little bit less angle on that bottom piece, but it'll be fine for now, I think. Zoom in here and see how we did up there. A little bit off. Nudge that back into place. Hopefully it didn't mess anything else up. Think about it. Photoshop, you start adjusting one thing, and then everything else is affected too. Okay, so is that reasonable? This logo is close to that logo, so just treat this as your reflection line, right? Everything should be more or less the same distance away. It can be a little closer, that's fine. That'll just be light hitting it at a sharper angle, but this is the close, that's the far. These two things are the close, that's the far, so that reflection looks fine. And now we play with it the same way that we play with the shadows, right? So I'm going to actually going to merge these two reflection layers. So if I go to FL, which is on top, and I right-click and I go to merge down, it's going to merge it with the layer right below, and now those are both on the same layer. So whatever adjustments I make, I'm going to be able to adjust in both directions. Okay. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to do that, and there's a reason. Got ahead of myself. I should make the reflection first before I do that, because I'm going to need to use two different gradients to fade them out. All right, now we're going to use our masking tools. Okay, it's not like a shadow where it's just a color that I can use a gradient to fade out. We actually need to mask this thing so it shows fully at the bottom of the object, and then it gradually gets less, because as the reflection gets further away from the original, the light tends to dissipate, which means it's going to fade out as it gets lower. I'm also going to add a white layer here. So I've got a layer. This is just going to serve as the background, and I'll just call it white, and I'll fill it with white. Okay, and make sure that that is under the reflection so you can see it. So we should be able to see the reflection against the white a little better than against the transparent background. So let's get started. We need layer masks. So I'm going to go to the FR and add a raster mask right here. And I'm going to the FL and also adding a raster mask. They are both fully in white right now, and usually I start with with nothing and paint back in. Okay? You don't have to work that way, but that's generally what I do. So I'm currently on the front left layer mask, and make sure you're clicked on the layer mask as well. We're going to go to Edit, we're going to go to Fill, and we're going to fill that with black. So it's gone, it's still there, but it's just hidden. And then we'll do the same thing on the other one. Edit, Fill with black. And then we'll bring them back using a gradient. A gradient is just color, so you can use a gradient on the masks just like we used used a paintbrush on the mask. So the benefit with a gradient is that instead of just painting back with a soft brush, which you can do as well, this will do it very consistently as long as you get the angle just right, which would be perpendicular, 90-degree angle from these lower sides. So let's check this, and we're going from white to black, which means we would start out here and go this way. You can change that around if you want, just by clicking in here, and then just making sure that's black and making this one white. That will reverse our gradient, so it goes from black to white, so we can start from here, which means, no, I did have that right, because we want to show and then hide. So this one would be black, and the other one would be white. We used to go in the other way around. So we do want this one as white, because we want to show everything close to the object. Okay, so we're going from white to black. So we want to have our masks gradients from white to black. So let's start front, right. Okay, we are on the mask, we're on the gradient tool. We're going to start full, and then we're going to fade it out to white over this distance. Okay, that was just a guess. If you like it, that's great. If not, do it again. Drag it a little further this time. Maybe I want less. Maybe I want it to fade out more, so I'll make a shorter line. Okay, now it looks like it fades at an angle like this. I probably want a little bit more fade over here than over here, so I'm just going to play with my angle of my adjustment a little bit. And then you're going to try and get it. See, that's obviously wrong, so we'll just keep playing with it here. Just want to get it, so that's pretty close right there. Usually 90 degrees is going to be your best option. Okay, that's not bad. And I could get rid of that edge down there just by painting a little bit later. So you see the angle here of where it goes from there to there. And if you think that it's fading out too quickly, you can always go back in here and you can always adjust. Click on this, either one of these. You can always adjust how much, okay, is fading. So you can pull the slider over and then you're going to get sort of more of that gray area. There we go. That's what I like. All right, now let's go to the front left, and we'll do the same thing. You want to match up the gradient in a way that it looks very similar to the other side. So that's just a little bit short. That's not bad right there. So if we back up, is it conceivable that it's sitting on a, that you've got some sort of reflection there? Sure it is. And if you're intending to have it sitting on, say, a mirrored surface or something, then you'd want to have a much longer gradient so that it's more reflective, but still fading out a little bit because light tends to fade out. So, that'd be more of a mirror finish. And you may want to have it fade out, very, very close as well. So, if you did that, you just make a very, very short gradient. Remember which layer you're on. And then, here you just have just a tiny little reflection. Maybe you need a little bit more angle there. A little bit longer. And it's just, it's trial and error till you get it where both reflected areas are more or less on the same angle and the same level of fade. Okay, so if you get it where you think it's not bad, at that point, then it's time to switch to the eraser tool with a very soft brush. A little bit more than that, maybe. And then again, when you're doing stuff like this, a bigger brush is probably a little better. Then we can just fade out. So if this is the mask, what I want to do is add a little bit more black in there, or I could go to actually the image part of it. So that's the reflected. Same thing on the other. And sooner or later, after playing with it, you get a little reflection. Again, this would be a very, very short reflection. If you had a mirrored finish, you'd want it to be much further. And at the end, then you can just lock that, and then you can merge all three of these together, just doing it in 2 steps. So you can merge down once, that combines those two, and then you can merge down again. And now this is, missing one here, merge down one more time. Now this is everything, not just the box and not just the reflected panels. Do that. So there you go. There's some very, very simple reflections and some simple shadows, and you can use those on your own creations. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.